Doug, humanitarian aid is the main priority at this conference in London. The UN has faced an incredibly tough task getting aid to those most in need, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in that report we just played, we saw, the refugees, the Syrian refugees who are now, and there are 4 million or more of them in Turkey, in Jordan, in Iraq, in Lebanon. And we talk about them all the time. The plight. Those perhaps most suffering are those who are literally trapped in Syria, millions more. They're by far the largest contingent of Syrians, much more than those who have left the country. They are literally trapped under bombardments, sieges, in some cases starvation. Why starvation? Well, aid organizations, basically, they've itemized it. They say that about 52 sieges are right now underway in Syria, within Syria itself. We hear the big ones make headlines. Madaya, we knew about that siege. Some aid finally got through to that town a couple of weeks ago, and the headlines went around the world. 52 sieges altogether. And according to the aid groups there on the ground, they're saying 49 of the 52 are imposed by the Syrian government of Bashar Assad. 2 of them are imposed by Islamist members of the opposition fighting Bashar Assad. 1 imposed by the Islamic State group. Interesting numbers. Bashar Assad's government has been accused by those same aid organizations and other observers on the ground of using essentially humanitarian aid as a weapon of war. That is, politicizing humanitarian aid. What does that mean? That means deliberately choking off the supplies of food, basic medicines, the things that the most vulnerable populations most need as a negotiating tactic or as a tactic to buy time. And we're continuing to see that in many cases right now on the ground. The UN, has come under a lot of criticism for not getting the aid to the people most in need. But it's a two-way street here. It's the Assad government which basically dictates the terms, for better or for worse, of access for the humanitarian workers trying to get aid to these to the Syrians on the ground in Syria. They're also the ones who happen to issue the visas for the UN officials who are involved in delivering that aid. You can see where there's a conflict here, and you could see where those accusations of politicizing humanitarian aid get very, very tricky, and the accusations can fly back and forth. But that is by far the case of the Syrians trapped there, the ones who we tend to talk about the least, yet are right now really suffering. We've heard the reports of them literally eating grass and leaves in order to survive in many cases.
So getting aid to those who need it the most is one thing. The conference also focusing, though, on education and getting refugees jobs.
Right. And this is where you could say, yes, there's obviously a humanitarian aspect to this donors conference, a big humanitarian aspect. It's not that everyone there is cynical, but there is an element, not to be denied, of self-interest in this donors conference. The self-interest stems from the fact that if you give, the logic being, if you give the refugees and who are already in the countries I mentioned in millions, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, you give them an incentive to stay there, not to try to make those treacherous, perilous journeys via land and sea to Europe and become the more than million that we saw come to Europe and arrive here last year, 2015. Give them an incentive to stay by providing money to those countries to perhaps have job training, give them some sort of entry-level job so they could at least make a livelihood there, and also give their kids schooling. One of the biggest, not unreported, but underreported stories of this entire Syrian war so far is the lost generation of kids who are going without an education or very minimal education, and where are they going to end up in a few years? So it's becoming now a long-term thing. This is not just an emergency now aid humanitarian crisis. People don't see this crisis going away. They're looking at longer-term, giving kids education because they don't seem to be going back to Syria tomorrow or even next month, and providing jobs for their families so that they could at least gain a livelihood.